Broyde is a professor of law and the academic director of the Law and Religion program at Emory University. He holds a JD from NYU Law School, Yor and Yad Yad Rabbinic Ordination from Yeshiva University, and has served on the Bet Din of America. He's published extensively on Jewish law and ethics, particularly on Jewish family law, which is both a scholarly and teaching interest for him, and perhaps most importantly for the group today, as a forthcoming publication edited with Benzo.
I'm going to talk today about arbitration in the context of religious communities in the United States, and I'm going to do so not necessarily or uniquely focused on Judaism, although there's lots of Jewish things to learn here. I guess I need to start by summarizing the very big picture. For hundreds of years, the common law, both in the United States and in every other common law country, didn't allow private arbitration. That's just the truth. You couldn't do it. You could, of course, arbitrate your private religious disputes, like, is this chicken kosher? Because that was not a secular dispute at all. But if you had a commercial dispute, you could not go in front of a private arbitration panel. They could not apply either New York law or Oklahoma law, never mind Jewish law. Private arbitration was prohibited, even when the arbitrators committed themselves to applying the law of the land. Cardozo has a famous New York State opinion about this, but this is in general true, and this was simply the norm. So religious tribunals didn't function in Western countries on matters that a secular court could and would resolve disputes because the common law wouldn't let them. Starting around 1970, which is not a long time ago, lots of people in this room were born already, the common law started to change. Not talking about 100 or 1,000 years ago, the Statute of Anne, 1450. We're talking about relatively recently. The common law started to change, and our legal system began opening themselves up to arbitration. And it confronted a very basic question whose answer still resonates with us. Now that we're open to arbitration, are we going to let the arbitrators decide only according to the secular law? Or are we going to let the arbitrators not only serve as a court, but pick their own law as well? And in the last 40 years, American law has clearly answered this question in favor of both choice of forum and choice of law. What does this mean practically? This is very important to understand. It means that when you and I have a dispute, we not only can go to a private arbitration panel to resolve our dispute in a dark room where nobody can see what we're doing, but we can agree that we're going to resolve our dispute in accordance with French law. Or we're going to resolve our dispute by rolling the dice. Or we're going to resolve our dispute by going up to Betsy the cow and kicking the cow twice. And if the cow moos once, I win. And moos twice, you win. And our secular legal system is perfectly comfortable with full-blown contract in which we not only agree to go to a tribunal that's not a court of the state, but we agree to substitute rules that we've made up for the law of the land. Now, of course, there are a few cases and a few areas of law where the government said, you can't do that. But in truth, those matters are few and far between. On almost all areas of secular law, at least secular private law, you and I can enter into an agreement in which we will resolve our disputes according to the law of France. You and I can get married in Denver, Colorado, and agree in a prenuptial agreement that the law of France will govern our marriage. And should we have a dispute about how to resolve our assets if we get divorced, this will be heard by a private tribunal made up exclusively of Polish-speaking Italian citizens who will resolve our dispute in accordance with French law. And when you ask yourself, why is that valid? Over the last 40 years, American law has given one consistent, very basic answer, which has become the dominant school of thought. It's contract. If you don't want your divorce resolved by Polish-speaking Italian citizens in accordance with French law, when you're handed this contract, what should you do? Not sign. Nobody's compelling you to sign. If you sign, you're bound. And you can bind yourself to all but the most preposterous propositions. So, of course, our common law system says, if I point a gun at you and say, sign or I'll shoot you, that's not really called agreeing. Because why? You didn't agree. So, too, I can't agree to give the arbitrators certain authority. I can't say if our Polish-speaking Italian arbitrators adjudicating according to French law want to chop off my hand, because that's what French law says. The government says, I'm so sorry. There are certain real limitations on authority. The real limitation on authority is the delegation of physical force. Only the United States government or the governments of the various states can incarcerate you, can chop off your hand. I'm not even sure in the United States they can chop off your hand, beat you. But short of things that are physical, we can delegate by contract almost any financial dispute, such that what we now have in the United States is both choice of forum and choice of law. This is very powerful. What this means is we allow the total private ordering of disputes. You could easily argue that that's a very bad idea. Justice Cardozo, as they say, a smart Jew, thought it was a very bad idea, and he wrote against it many times. But this is the law of the land, and it's been the law of the land for 25 or 30 years. It ebbs and flows in its little details, but in its biggest picture, the United States permits two people by contract to resolve any dispute they want in any way they want, with any tribunal that they want, in reference to any law that they want, including a law that they will make up right here and now. We will agree to resolve our disputes by the law code of the state of Colorado with every sixth word deleted. Sort of a totally retarded provision. But we both agreed. That's good enough. We don't need anything more than that. That's been the law of the United States for 25 years, give or take, and it's only solidly entrenched itself into American legal culture. We are very pro-arbitration, as a few of the speakers have said in a few different settings. Again, there are certain things you can't arbitrate, but they're obscurata in our legal system. You can arbitrate almost any commercial dispute, and you can arbitrate almost any marriage dispute. So if you can arbitrate any marriage dispute, any commercial dispute, what else is left? So who else are you going to fight with? If you're not going to fight with your family, you're not going to fight with your business partners, so who else are you going to fight with? It's only a small percentage that you can't arbitrate. This has opened up, in an enormous way, religious arbitration. What has happened is it now turns out that religious organizations that want to arbitrate disputes really can. All you have to do is get people to sign arbitration agreements, and if the arbitration agreement empowers the religious court to resolve disputes, they can. And if you don't want to go in front of a religious tribunal to resolve your disputes as the religious tribunal wants to, what should you do? Not sign. If you sign, you're stuck. And when you say, but I didn't understand what Jewish law says, the courts say, tough luck. That's no different than the fact that I didn't understand what French law says, or I didn't understand what the Uniform Code of Colorado with every sixth word deleted would look like. You signed it. You understood that you were assigning your rights to this dispute panel. That is more or less good enough. That's more or less good enough. So what's happened in the last 30 years in the United States, first in the Jewish tradition, is rabbinical tribunals, Batei Din, rabbinical courts have now started opening themselves up everywhere, all across the United States, to hear family law disputes and to hear commercial disputes. There are many of them, and they hear a broad variety of disputes. Surprisingly enough, at some level, there are more commercial disputes resolved in the United States by the rabbinical courts than there are in Israel, having something to do with the fact that Israeli law does not really permit the full breadth of arbitration that American law does, and it explicitly prohibits the rabbinical courts in Israel from hearing these disputes. So it's a much narrower system, reflecting the fact that some aspects of Israeli law are still governed by a more ancient version of the common law. That's another story for a different lecture. But throughout the United States, there are rabbinical courts that are doing this. Now, why don't people go to these rabbinical courts? This is a very important question. They are cheaper and faster. So whenever you say to somebody, cheaper and faster, people say, what? That sounds like a good idea. Why don't people go? The answer is very important. The law is not the expectation of most people. Meaning you and I enter into an agreement, we enter into an agreement with a background of American law. And when somebody walks in and adjudicates our dispute through a legal system other than the prism that we negotiated the contract in, it's quite possible that they will reach a novel result that neither you nor I anticipated. And the first time I go to a dispute in which I know in my heart of hearts I should lose, but I win, what do? I never go back again. How come? Because just like I won this one fortuitously, and I didn't deserve to, the next one that I think I should win, I might lose. Nobody really likes arbitrary justice. Sometimes you win through arbitrary justice, but it's not a good system to participate in. Jewish law, no different than French law or Italian law or Polish law as judged by Italian citizens, is somewhat nuanced and complex. And unless you keep your eyes on the law when you enter into the contract, what the legal system does when it looks at your contract might not reflect what you really intend. So there's a good, sane reason why lots of people are hesitating to do this. It has to do with the fact that we generally conduct ourselves in accordance with secular law, and then when I go over my agreements with you, and we apply a different legal system, all of a sudden we get very different results. I'll give you one from family law that makes obvious sense. The law in the United States is neutral on the following question. Is adultery a proper reason to end a marriage, and should an adulterer or an adulteress be penalized for sexual misconduct in a marriage? Most American states, at this point 39 out of the 50, take the view that adultery is not misconduct. And when you enter into a marriage and you cheat on your spouse, that's maybe not socially a nice thing, like blowing your nose in public, but it's not a violation of your marital obligations because it doesn't directly harm your spouse. Now, Jewish law has a very contrary view. Jewish law is very hostile to adultery. It treats it as a bad thing, and it penalizes you in divorce for adultery. Now, that's a very important piece of information when, let's randomly pick somebody. I won't pick it. Oh, okay, Ira raised his hand. Somebody who's randomly considering adultery. So, of course, when you randomly consider adultery, you raise your hand. When you randomly consider adultery, what's the first thing you do? You ask your lawyer, what will be the consequences? And your lawyer has to say to you, well, what legal system are you being adjudicated under? This is very important to understand. So when you adjudicate a legal dispute at the end by a legal system that neither one of you thought was going to be binding when you entered into, you get all sorts of weird results. So lots of people, notwithstanding the fact that the Jewish tradition and its rabbinical courts are cheap and fast, are correctly leery of the substance of Jewish law, not because the substance of Jewish law is better or worse, it's just different. It's different so that if you knew about it in advance, you could deal with it, but when it pops in at the end, it somehow produces results that you didn't realistically expect. But notwithstanding this fact, there are lots and lots and lots of court cases, cases that could be in court that are actually adjudicated in the Bate Din. I've sat on matters that involve $100 million. I've sat on large construction disputes. They're out there. Large disputes are resolved by rabbinical courts by parties who find the virtues of speed and efficiency worth taking the risk that the legal code will be somewhat different, particularly in areas of law where it's hard to imagine how substantively different the law would be. It's easy to imagine this. So too in the area of family law, there are lots of disputes that come in front of the Jewish law tribunals because there's a huge community that lives their family life in accordance with Jewish law and not in accordance with secular law. But what's happened is since the secular government has said you can enter into these agreements, the rabbinical courts are out there distributing agreements and building a community that is opting out of secular law, a functional version of Professor Dane's legal pluralism. It's people are opting out and they are signing arbitration agreements at the time that they marry saying, if we have a dispute, we agree to go over there to that rabbinical tribunal to resolve their disputes. There are hundreds and thousands of those agreements out there. There are many, many, many of them, and they're very commonly used within the traditional Jewish community. What's been interesting to watch is how this is slowly spreading. I serve as the advisor to 2 Islamic law tribunals in the United States. Now, I know more Islamic law than many of you, but nonetheless, almost none. What am I doing serving as an advisor to an Islamic law court? The answer is they're struggling to function in the American environment to imitate what the rabbinical courts are doing. Because it turns out that while there's a great deal of acceptance of legal pluralism in America, you have to learn to speak the language of the American legal system in order to be accepted. We, the American legal system, emphasizes in an enormous way substantive due process. Substantive due process means that when you run an arbitration panel, the secular legal system doesn't tell you what rules you should apply, what's the real law that undergirds the matter, but what does our secular legal system tell you? What your procedures should look like, how you should conduct notice. How much information do you want to give the parties before they get started? How do they decide whether the arbitrators are fair? And people who are just starting out in the United States need advice and information as to how to navigate the requirements necessary to run a proper dispute resolution panel. And now in the United States, I'm just supervising a doctoral dissertation by a truly gifted graduate student. She's surveying the Islamic courts. It turns out that you know what there are in the United States? Almost 30 Islamic courts. Serving who? The Islamic community. And who's serving as arbitrators? The new crop of lawyers who are graduating from law school, who are faithful members of the Islamic community, while simultaneously well-trained in American law. They're growing their own arbitration panels, and they're substantively modifying Islamic law procedurally in order to live in the American environment. Please.
So to what extent do you think that dual set of training is necessary, right? That is to say, members of the Rabbinical Council of America are, if I understand correctly, lawyers trained with JDs as well as trained in Jewish law, whereas in the corresponding Bet Din in the conservative movement, the joint Bet Din, they are not, right? And so to what extent does that dual training actually push the outcomes of the Bet Din to look more like Jewish law and reduce that uncertainty?
If you don't have lawyers involved in the process, you won't be able to successfully adjudicate commercial disputes. You won't be able to withstand the challengers the loser will make to your process and procedure. Rabbinical courts that don't have lawyers inevitably confine themselves to what we would call religious disputes, divorces, kosher, if you want to resolve commercial disputes between people who are interested in fighting because they're fighting about something very important. What's that very important thing they're fighting about? Money. Money. So when you ask me, how much will I spend to fight for $1 million? How do I calculate this through? What's my likelihood of success? The discounted market value of my expenses, and people routinely challenge your procedures. And you won't be able to successfully run an arbitration panel that addresses commercial dispute matters unless you have readily available lawyers who ensure that your process and procedure is consistent with secular law.
But when you say that, what you mean is you're not saying anything about the substance of the law itself, so much as...
Because American law doesn't care about the substantive law. American law is only interested in procedure. I'll give you an example. In New York State, to conduct a valid arbitration proceeding, you need to provide the parties with written notice 7 days in advance. Not 6 days in advance, not 3 days in advance, 7 days in advance. And it needs to be conducted during business hours on certain days. And if you conduct them off business hours, off business days, you run the risk that the secular court will void your hearing. Not because what you're doing is intrinsically wrong, but because secular law tightly regulates the procedures of arbitration. How do you know that you have to send out notices 7 days in advance? They teach you that in law school, so to speak.
But couldn't that information be managed by like a professional manager of the bet-in rather than the people who are actually making the decision?
It doesn't matter, sort of, the person who's managing the procedure has to be embedded enough in the process that they can look at everything that's done and say, this will not fly. So it doesn't matter what you call this person, and it doesn't matter whether he sits on the panel de facto or de jure. The person who's comfortable mitigating the requirements of secular law with the requirements of Jewish law has to be continuously present and ongoingly involved in an intimate way. It's not important if you call him the director or the coordinator or a panel member or simply anything else.
So when you advise these Muslim students who are getting JDs and then participating in these arbitration panels, when they set up these panels, are they setting up panels where there's kind of a manager who has a JD, or does everyone have a JD?
It varies from time to time and place to place and resources available. If everybody has a JD, then one of the JDs can sort of sometimes take a break. If you're the only JD in the room, meaning if I were to ask you the same question about cardiology, you would understand that sort of having 3 cardiologists is much more expensive, but probably produces a better outcome than having 1 cardiologist and 2 rabbis. Meaning, can 1 cardiologist and 2 rabbis conduct a cardiological exam? Yes, but you want to make sure that the 1 cardiologist is paying much closer attention than when there are 3. So the more lawyers you have floating around the process, the more likely you are to not make a boo-boo. And boo-boos, by the way, are sort of what people do. I don't mean this in a critical way. I mean, whenever you've conducted a legal hearing as an arbitrator, sometimes you make mistakes. How come? Because that's sort of part of the human condition. People make mistakes. Why do they make mistakes? Because they woke up this morning to the sounds of their 3-year-old child explaining to them that it was time to get up now, and you looked at your clock and it said 2:45. And sort of you had a bad morning. Because like all of us sort of live this life because you took the train in this morning and it stopped 900 feet short of the platform. They told you to walk the rest of the way in the track, because sometimes we all have bad days. The more tightly you watch the law here, the less likely you are that your errors will be reversible errors. In the last 10 years, the evangelical Christian community has given up on controlling secular law in America. One of the take-homes of gay marriage in the United States is the evangelical Christian community feels deeply disenfranchised from family law, and they are slowly but surely forming their own communities. They have a Christian conciliation community at peacemakers.net that's driving Christian rabbinical courts. Now, I know that's not the term. Christian arbitration tribunals that are resolving matters consistent with Christian law or Christian ethics and Christian values. They're hearing commercial disputes. They're hearing family law disputes. They're hearing inheritance disputes. They're out there hearing the same kinds of disputes as everybody else is. What's driving people to them? The same things that's driving people to rabbinical courts. Christian conciliation is fast. It is cheap. It is value-driven. Now, before you grab onto something that's value-driven, what's the most important question you want to ask?
Does value equal price?
Does
value equal price?
Well, no, I think the most important question you want to ask is, do I agree with the values? Or will the values that they're bringing not reflect the intention of the two of us? Meaning, whatever my attitude towards adultery is, I want the arbitration panel to reflect our values. And whatever our attitudes towards compromise and conciliation. Let's consider, for example, the rabbinical court's attitude, which says compromise is preferable to truth on commercial disputes. That's a fascinating attitude. That's very interesting to talk about, and we could readily discuss whether that's right or wrong. But what's the most important thing you have to decide before you enter into an arbitration in which compromise and mediation and settlement is preferable to the absolute truth of winning or losing? It's whether you want that. You might prefer to compromise when you're in a dispute with your brother about your family real estate business, and you might not be prepared to enter into a compromise when you're in a dispute with some total and complete stranger who walked into your house, grabbed 12 pieces of your clothes, and as a compromise proposes giving you back 5 of them. You might not, meaning compromise doesn't always serve a valuable purpose. Sometimes the answer with compromise is, no, I just want to win. And I want you to lose. That's an important moral lesson too. So what the Christian Conciliation Board is looking at is it's determining what are their values, and it's sharing that with the public. And by the way, it gets much more fringier than that. What do I mean by that? Now that you know that we can pick any values that we want, you'll discover all sorts of weird things out there. I'll give you a website. You can go on Google and you can look at Christian domestic discipline. This is a website that advocates husbands and wives getting married with an agreement that when one of them misbehaves, the other can hit them. And they have a contract that they want you to sign in which you agree to accept a certain amount of physical violence in your marriage as a response to misbehavior. Now, I personally think that's on the outer limits of what the American legal system would accept, because we tend to have a monopoly on force. But I'm not 100% sure, because a lot of it depends on how hard the hitting is, because we recognize parents hit children. When you want to hit your child, as all of us has on occasion wanted to do, hit their child with a baseball bat, the American legal system says, I'm so sorry. That is way too much force, but maybe a little bit of spanking is tolerable. So what happens in this model is the breadth of small minorities congregate among themselves, and they form their own arbitration panels, and it allows communities to develop their own values when they reach a critical mass. If you don't believe me, all you need to do is look at the Hutterite litigation in Montana. Hutterites are a Christian commune in which when you join the Christian commune, you promise to give all your assets to the commune and subject yourself to their arbitration process should you ever want to leave. And both courts in the United States and courts in Canada, they cross the Canadian-US border, have upheld these agreements. And they say as follows: if you don't like these agreements, that's no problem. What should you do? Not sign them. But if you sign them, this is like joining an Israeli kibbutz. You join the kibbutz, you give the kibbutz all your assets. You don't want to join, don't join. But if you join, you're stuck playing with the rules that you agree to play by. So it's important to understand that what's happening in America, which we see in the Jewish community, is not a uniquely Jewish phenomenon. What's happening in the United States is a common phenomenon. People are writing arbitration agreements in which they incorporate their own rules, and to make sure their rules are readily enforced, they put them in arbitration panels that are well known to be sympathetic and accepting of their rules, and this becomes a self-reinforcing mechanism, and it's creating isolated communities of idiosyncratic rules. By the way, that's a perfectly fine way to define me and you. Isolated communities of idiosyncratic rules. You don't like to think of the Jewish community that way, but others think of us as isolated communities of idiosyncratic rules, and it turns out there are lots of us. You don't need to have 50 million people to form this kind of community. You just need a critical mass in one area. Atlanta has a large critical mass of black Hebrews. We have a large critical mass of black Hebrews. Not millions of them, but they live in one place. They have their own little community. They function according to their own rules with some sort of an arbitration process. It's going to turn out that the process that allows you to pick your own tribunal and to pick your own law is going to allow an incredible diversity of tribunals and laws to blossom. And you and I will look at these many different laws, and you know what we'll say? Gosh, that's really weird. That's really weird. By the way, people look at our rules, and what do they say? Gosh, that's really weird. That's okay, because the defense to weirdness isn't, no, my rules are not really weird. The defense to weirdness is, excuse me, it's none of your business whether my rules are weird or not. What you need to know is we don't apply our rules to anybody unless they sign the contract agreeing to obey the rules. The question of whether this will be sustainable in the long run, or will all of us move to the solution of some Canadian provinces, which is to outlaw private arbitration of family law matters outside the law of the province, is an open question. My gut is that the United States will not head in that direction, and that these idiosyncratic private tribunals will only grow stronger over time, and with greater secular authority behind them. But sort of predictions of the future are always very complicated because they're easy to get wrong. It's much easier to make predictions about the past than it is to make predictions about the future. But already one Canadian province opted out and said, no, when it comes to family law matters will only be governed everywhere by the law of the state. I could see other states, I could see states moving in that direction, although it would require a dramatic reformation of many different aspects of the law as we now understand it, but I don't view that reformation as utterly beyond the pale. It would be a return to the common law rules that Justice Cardozo so deeply defended. So to summarize, individualized communities, religious communities, are grouping together, and they're forming tribunals. The rabbinical courts were the first in that group, but having shown that that model works, everybody's out there doing the same thing, from the Islamic community in the United States to the Mormon community to the evangelical Christian community, and so on and so forth, with many different communities forming their own little tribunals to adjudicate disputes consistent with their own standards. You can't do this unless you comfortably train dual system people so that they can mitigate between the procedural requirements of secular law and the substantive requirements of your own religious system. So it's not going to happen until you have a sophisticated legal community among your adherents. But once you do that, you've now succeeded. And each of these individual communities will start promulgating their own rules, Congregants, community members, will do what? They'll vote with their feet. What do I mean by that? I'll join an institution and they'll say to me, sign this contract. And I'll look at them and say, what? Are you nuts? And I'll walk away because I don't want to sign this kind of contract. Or I'll read the contract and say, yes, this very much reflects my family values. Just a month and a half ago, I reviewed a contract for an evangelical church in Georgia that was, they made every single couple sign this contract when they got married in the church. The contract said that both parties agree that adultery will not take place in their marriage, and if adultery does take place in their marriage, they agree that the adulterer or adulteress will forfeit their financial interest in the marital estate. That's an interesting provision. I would sign it. I assume my wife would sign it too. I don't know if Ira would sign it since he already sort of volunteered to be the person in the hypothetical. He's a wonderful man, your husband. I'm totally teasing you. But I think that it's just important to understand. People look at these contracts and they make their own choices. It's well known, I teach family law at Emory, that Donald Trump distributes a different agreement. It's now called in New York a Trump agreement. The Trump agreement says as follows: both parties understand that husband will commit adultery and they're accepting of it in their marriage. And what? If you want to marry Donald Trump, you have to sign the agreement. Now, would you sign such an agreement? I mean, I wouldn't. But obviously, he's had a string of spouses who have agreed to sign this agreement because there must be something about him that makes it worthwhile. People read agreements. They decide if on the whole it's beneficial to them, and they go on. So I think that that's where American law is heading for the short-term future, although it's hard to predict if there will be a counter-revolution that eventually returns us to the common law rule of no arbitration at all, and all disputes will be resolved in accordance with secular law. Thank you very much.